This set of videos will go over a version of the Beowulf story that I'd like for you to compare and contrast with the one from our textbook. Beowulf is an old story. It probably was based on an original person, some warrior who existed maybe in the 500s to the 600s, who developed a great reputation for doing brave deeds. And then around the 700s or 800s, people started adding to his legend, much like they did the King Arthur legend around the same period. And Beowulf grew into a larger-than-life figure, almost our first Superman that we have in the English language. Then this poem that was written about Beowulf in the 700s and 800s, we do not have a copy of that, only a reference that it existed. So our version of Beowulf that we have left to us comes from the year 1000. And so you can imagine how over the centuries of oral storytelling, how that story probably got altered, got changed to be our version of Beowulf that we have for today. But here's a page from the old manuscript from the year 1000. You can see it's not in very good shape. So it's a miracle that that one survived the Viking invasions that occurred later on. Beowulf is the story of a young warrior who built a great reputation for himself fighting monsters early in his life. His father was brother to a king, King Hygelac, and so Beowulf grew up in the royal family. King Hygelac felt very protective of his nephew. He loved him very, very much, and King Hygelac was not sure that he would ever marry and have a child, so Beowulf was considered by a lot of people to be a potential heir to the throne. Well, Beowulf simply liked to hang out with his friends and do as many brave deeds as he could and build his strength up. And he had a best friend called Breca. So Beowulf and Breca would climb to a high cliff overlooking the ocean with their heavy ancestral swords in one hand and dive off the cliff into the water and start swimming. And they would keep swimming until one gave up. Most of the time Beowulf won the contests. But one day, the ocean began to churn, the water started to churn, the waves began to billow. Neither boy knew really what was happening. Beowulf and Breca were about 14, 15 at the time, and the waves were so great, Breca was swept away. Beowulf was left alone, and then all of a sudden Beowulf realized what was happening. Beowulf knew that sea monsters were coming out of the sea. Beowulf had to fight the sea monsters, and Beowulf won. And he went back and he told what had happened. For a long time, people thought Breca had drowned. Later on, Beowulf learned the current had swept Breca all the way to Norway, that he had been taken in by a family. He met a cute girl, got married, and eventually had a big family. So Beowulf was very happy to hear that his best friend had not died after all. As time went on, and Beowulf grew up, his father had died. There was a neighbor king, King Hrothgar, who had once helped Beowulf's father. They had fought in a war together, and King Hrothgar had saved Beowulf's father's life. But Beowulf's father had died since then. And Beowulf grew up with a sense of obligation that he had never met King Hrothgar, the man who had once saved his father's life, and he felt a necessity to go meet that king and try to help him out, because everybody knew in the territory that this neighbor king, King Hrothgar, was having monster trouble. He had built a beautiful hall to house his warriors, but they could only meet in the daytime. At night, a monster came out of the swamp, broke down the doors, and was so huge and great and mighty and evil, he would simply pick up the warriors, bite their heads off, swallow the blood down, and throw them away. So that monster had to be taken care of. And Beowulf approached his uncle, King Hygelac, and said, "King, my uncle, you know that I grew up fighting monsters, and I've gotten a pretty good reputation as a strong young man. I have an obligation to go help King Hrothgar get rid of this monster Grendel. King Hrothgar saved my father's life once, and we didn't get to pay him back in any way, so I want to set sail over to the land of the Danes, and I want to ask the king if I can help him get rid of his monster." Well, Beowulf's uncle, King Hygelac, did not want him to go. He loved Beowulf, and he said, "Now, Beowulf, I know King Hrothgar, and he's not expecting anything from you. Your father went to help him in a military matter, and so there's really no payback needed. Plus, he has very strong warriors, and if they haven't been able to get rid of this monster Grendel, I don't see how you can." But Beowulf would not be deterred. He said, "Well, unless you absolutely forbid me not to go, I'm determined to go and at least ask him if I can help him." And so his uncle thought about it, and King Higelac said, "Well, listen, I want you to take some friends of yours with you. I don't want you going by yourself." And so Beowulf, as a young man, said, "All right, I'll do that, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you for letting me go." And so Beowulf got together some of his companions who were eager to make a name for themselves in battle. And they set sail for the land of the Danes, away from his own people, the Geats. Beowulf landed on the coast with his men, and an old coast guard came up asking Beowulf what he wanted. Beowulf's men were somewhat insulted. They were risking their lives to help these people, but Beowulf wasn't insulted. He realized the man was just doing his job. And he said, "Well, I am Beowulf. I've come from my uncle King Higelac's court, and I've come to see what I can do against your monster Grendel." Well, it was plain. The old man was a brave old soldier, but he didn't like to hear about Grendel. He said, "Now, son, listen. You go home. You don't need to be here. We've had brave men to try to fight Grendel, and it hasn't done any good. We just quit meeting at nighttime because that's when he comes out of his swamp to attack us. So we just go to our own homes and put the lights out because Grendel hates lights, and he hates laughter, and he hates joy. So night times are a pretty sad place around these parts. But young man, please go back home. We appreciate your help, but we really don't want to be responsible for what happens to you." Well, Beowulf's men were a little insulted at that, but Beowulf wasn't insulted. He politely thought about it for a minute, and then he said, "Well, sir, I at least need to pay my respects to your king since I already got here." And the old man said, "Okay, that's fine. Get your men in marching order, and I'll take you to Hall Herot." And he said, "You'll be surprised, Beowulf. It's a beautiful hall that our king built for us, but unfortunately we can't sleep there at night." So the old man led Beowulf and his friends on the way to Hall Herot. Herot means a deer, and when Beowulf got there, he realized why. Deer antlers decorated the place all over the outside of the walls, as well as above the rafters in the great hall. The king greeted Beowulf, but without very much confidence. He said, "Well, hello, Beowulf." He said, "Yes, I knew your father. He was a good man, and you don't need to repay me for anything. He helped me out once upon a time when I had a skirmish here in my kingdom, and um, I was very proud to have him help me, and I'm sorry to hear that he passed away. He was a good man. But Beowulf, you don't owe me anything, and it's true that I did save your father's life. He got cornered one time, while we were fighting, and I came to his assistance, but he was here to help me in the first place, so you really don't owe me anything." And Beowulf said, "Well, sir, I'd still like to see what I can do against this monster Grendel." Well, King Hrothgar had an advisor named Unferth. Now, Unferth was a very unpleasant fellow. Unferth said, "King, I wouldn't trust this person. I've heard about Beowulf. He's just a little braggart. I've heard that he even tried to drown his best friend because that friend was a better swimmer than Beowulf." Well, all the warriors gathered there, perked up their ears. They wanted to hear that story. They love stories. And so Beowulf knew, of course, they were talking about Breca, and he told them the truth about Breca. That Breca was just fine. This had happened back when they were boys, and that Breca had a family and was doing just fine. Well, the other warriors laughed when they heard Beowulf's story. They liked Beowulf. He was a plain-spoken young man, and they didn't like Unferth anyway, and they liked the way the mild-mannered stranger had put him in his place. The king said, "Well, Beowulf, what kind of weapons do you plan to use against Grendel if I let you fight the monster?" Well, Beowulf, in politeness to the king, had left his sword outside. He didn't bring it in the king's hall. He said, "Well, I decided I'm not going to use a sword." The king said, "You're not going to use your sword against the monster?" "Well, sir, have swords been any good so far?" And the king had to admit they had not. But he couldn't see how one man, however good and strong, dared to face the fiend without any weapons. And Beowulf held up his strong wrists and hands, and he said, "These are my weapons enough." Well, the king wondered if Beowulf was somewhat touched in the head, but he said, "Well, I'll stay up with you. Grendel has never tried to attack me directly. I don't know why." Well, the reason why was that the king has always been considered God's man on earth. And whenever the monster came into the hall, he would pick up the other warriors and kill them. But every time he approached King Hrothgar's throne, to the monster, who loved darkness, the throne of the king looked like a great fiery light, and he never could stand to approach it. So King Hrothgar had always been safe, but even King Hrothgar did not know why. All night long they waited, and waited, and waited.
Just a reminder.
And they waited for hours until very, very early in the morning. They heard something crunching through the outlands, something scratching at the great oak door. And then all of a sudden, before anybody knew what was happening, the great oaken doors were down, flattened. Some of the warriors who were there by the doors got smashed by the doors, and this monster came in. Beowulf retched at the smell of this swamp creature. He began to pick up warriors, bite their heads off, drink their blood down. And Beowulf approached the creature. The creature grabbed Beowulf. Beowulf grabbed the creature. The creature felt the good in this man burn through to him, but still, he didn't understand a stranger like this. And Beowulf grabbed the monster's arm and just held on. Well, the monster jerked his arm back and forth, trying to get this little creature off his arm. And Beowulf wrapped his own legs around a big pillar there in the king's hall. And the monster jerked. And there was a fearful tearing of sinew, muscle, and fountaining of blood everywhere. Beowulf had pulled Grendel's arm right out of its socket. And the monster howled as though all the men he had ever eaten howled out too. And the monster realized he was going to die from that pain. He left the king's hall to go back to his swamp, where he lived in a deep, deep swampy pool. Everybody looked around and they couldn't believe what Beowulf had done. The warriors who were there cheered for Beowulf. And they took that big, green, swampy arm and they hung it from a hook in the rafters. The king swore that he would give Beowulf great riches, great gold for what he had done. The king also promised Beowulf he would give him many horses for what he had done. But Beowulf really didn't expect any treasure. He was simply glad to help rid the land of this horrible monster. Well, they had a feast for Beowulf that lasted 3 days. And on the 3rd day of the feast, Beowulf was going to leave with his friends the next morning. As everybody slept, another creature came into the hall. She was quiet. She moved in a sinuous way like a snake. One of the king's old warriors at the door woke up and saw her, but she strangled him to death before he could speak. She saw her son's arm from the hook in the rafters and took it down, hoping to take it back to their swamp home so she could save her son. This was Grendel's mother. Everybody woke up the next morning. They'd had bad dreams all night. The king rushed forward and he screamed because the old man at the door had been his best friend Aesir. They had been boys together, went to war together, served together, and the king was broken-hearted. And he wondered what in the world this could be. Well, his wife, Queen Weal'theow, she of the golden hair, caught her breath and said, "There's only one thing it could be. And she's 10 times more terrible than her son. This is Grendel's mother." And Beowulf said, "Well, then I've just left you people in a worse shape than when I found you. I will have to go against Grendel's mother." And that's in our next video.